Hello, Professor Hinkinson here for the second lecture for topic 2. And here we're going to be focusing on the Constitution. All right, so what is this lecture going to cover? Well, we are going to take a brief look at the Articles of Confederation and the pathway from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitutional Convention. We'll do a brief outline of the Constitution. They give you much more information in the textbook, but I just want to make sure that you understand how the Constitution is organized, and you can read the more of the details in the text. Then we're going to look at the conflict that takes place at the Constitutional Convention and the two main sources of disagreement. Those were around the issue of representation and the issue of slavery. And then we're going to look at the Constitution and the mechanisms that are in place in the Constitution that serve to push the Constitution towards making decisions that are for the greater good and placing a check on the abuse of power. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so as you know, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union is the first Constitution of the United States. But I just wanted to make sure that we covered some basic points about the Articles of Confederation before we move on to talk about the Constitution. For one thing, I want you to make sure that you take a look in the textbook about what is a confederation, and furthermore, why did the first framers at the Second Continental Congress decide to craft a constitution that created a federation. Now, a federation is a way of distributing power within a nation. There are lots of different ways of distributing power. You could place all of the power in the hands of the national government. You could place all or most of the power in the hands of the subnational units of government, in this case, in the states, or you could have a power sharing relationship between the national government and the states. A confederation is where power is concentrated in the hands of the states. And that was the power sharing relationship that was developed in the Articles of Confederation. Why did we select a confederation as the first way of sharing power within our new nation? The reason is because the states just haven't come out of a power sharing relationship that was all or mostly in the hands of the monarch. They were very worried about creating a strong national government for this new nation that would basically serve to act as a king, a monarch, or a sovereign, right? And so they wanted to make sure that power was greatly diffused, and they wanted that power to be diffused into the states. So a confederation under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union gave the vast majority of the powers to the states. And because of the concerns that the new states had with the abuse of power. And so under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one institution of government. There was no presidency. There was no national judiciary. There was only a national Congress, and it was called the Congress of the Confederation. Furthermore, each state got one vote, right? And so that there wasn't a power sharing relationships between the big states and the smaller states in terms of population, but each state got one vote, kind of making sure that all the states were viewed as equal players. And the Congress of the Confederation could do some things. They could declare war. They could create treaties. They could appropriate money. But 9 out of the 13 states had to agree to do that. And so, again, giving a lot of power to the states. This new national government didn't have a national army. That the only armies were the state militias, and those state militias could come together if they decided to fight like like an intruder. But there was no standing army. It was limited in terms of its ability to raise taxes, and it had a hard time regulating foreign and international trade. Okay, so on the one hand, it was good because a lot of that power was made by the states, or a lot of those decisions were made by the states. but because the national government had really limited powers, that is where its weaknesses come into play. So you can read more about this in the textbooks. But your textbook talks about that. One of the reasons why there was a movement to get rid of the Articles of Confederation was because this new nation had a hard time conducting foreign affairs. They talk about how because the national government couldn't really regulate treaties or trade, other countries were just basically negotiating with states individually. The national government couldn't regulate commerce between the states, right? And so that made it very difficult to create a vibrant national economy. There were other concerns as well, because it was difficult to raise taxes. This new country was in a lot of debt from the war that it fought and owed a lot of money to France, and it wasn't able to pay off its war debts. And there were other things that your textbook talks about as well. The rising sort of insurgencies within states with no national government being able to do anything about it. And so, even though it did have some strengths, which you can read about in the textbook, the weaknesses were seen as being fairly profound. And so, the Annapolis Convention was called in 1786 in order to come up with a decision to hold a convention to come up with a new constitution. And also make sure that you read about Shays' Rebellion, which is the farmer uprising in Massachusetts, and how that really scared folks in terms of sort of the inability for the national government to control its peoples. And this just shows you a visualization of the confederalism versus federalism. I just put this up here because our next chapter is on federalism. So you can really sort of see the difference that the Articles of Confederation formed a confederal power sharing relationship where the states had most of the power and the national government was sort of a servant to the states. That the With the new constitution, it creates a power sharing relationship between the federal government and the states, or the national government and the states. And it forms a power sharing relationship known as federalism. Okay. We'll talk more about that when we get to the issue of chapter 3, which is dedicated to federalism. Okay, so let's talk about the Constitutional Convention, some of the consensus that was struck, the conflict, and the compromises that were present in Philadelphia. That convention was called in May of 1787, and it lasted until October. And so the hot months and what took place during the Constitutional Convention. Okay, let's talk about how the Constitution is outlined before we talk about the Constitutional Convention. Now, the Constitution is comprised of 7 articles and 27 amendments. When the Constitution was initially ratified, the ratification process was just the 7 articles, and then the Bill of Rights was added soon after, the first 10 amendments. And so let's just take a look at what these different articles are dedicated to. So, Articles 1, 2, and 3 establish the institutions of government. Keep in mind, under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one institution of national government, and that was the Congress. This new Constitution creates a Congress, it creates a new branch, the presidency, and it also creates the federal judiciary. And even Article 1, the Congress that it creates, is quite different. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was unicameral, only one branch. The new national legislature is bicameral. There are 2 branches. And so Article 1, Section 1 establishes the House of Representatives, and Article 1, Section 2 establishes the Senate. As we know, the representation in the House is based on population. And as we know, representation in the Senate is based on, just by virtue of being a state, all states get 2 senators. The presidency is a new institution, and Article 2 tells us about the powers of the presidency. We'll be learning more about that as we move on in the semester, although they do a nice summary of each of the articles in your textbook. And the judiciary, Article 3 establishes a national judiciary, in particular the Supreme Court, and then tells us that Congress can create other lower level national members or courts, national courts. This is new because there were all the courts were at the state and local level under the Articles of Confederation. There was no one presiding court that was the court of last resort, as is the Supreme Court. Moving on from there, Article 4 tells us about the relationships that the states have to each other. Since this is a power sharing relationship that's created within this new Constitution, states need to know not just what their relationship to the national government is, but they need to know what their relationship to other states is. And so it talks about the way states must treat other states. It also tells us about how new states can be admitted to this national union. Article 5 tells us about how to amend the Constitution, and make sure you read about that in your textbook. There are 4 different paths or routes taken to amend the Constitution. Article 6 tells us about the legal status of the Constitution. So since this is a national constitution that has a lot of power, it establishes some sort of ground rules in terms of its legal status. And probably the most important aspect of Article 6 is that it tells us that federal law is supreme. It is the supreme law of the land. And so that if there is a conflict between federal and state law, federal law trumps state law. And then finally, Article 6 tells us how this Constitution will be ratified. Article 7 tells us how this Constitution will be ratified. That was only used once, but we needed a mechanism for telling states how they would be involved in the ratification process. So your textbook does a good job of giving you much more detail about each of these articles, and I would expect that you take a look at that before you take your reading quiz and also in preparation for your exams. So the first thing that we're going to look at regarding the Constitutional Convention is the point of contention, where the delegates were in conflict with each other. And your textbook points out that there are 2 main points of conflict at the Constitution. The one is about the question of representation. Since the Articles of Confederation, all of the states were equal players, there was a lot of controversy about how people should be represented in this new national legislature. Should the people and the states all have an equal voice, or should the states that have more people in them get more of a say? And so we'll talk about how the conflict between that representation and how that conflict was resolved. The other point of conflict at the convention was the question over slavery. Slavery was legal in all states but Massachusetts at the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And so the question was what was this new Constitution going to say about slavery? Was it going to end slavery? I don't think anybody at the Constitutional Convention thought that that was going to happen, but they knew that something was going to be said about slavery. And also, since there were people who were held in servitude and in slavery, the question is how are those people going to be counted? Were they property or were they citizens when it came to the issue of representation? So let's take a look in detail at these 2 main points of conflict. All right. Well, when the Constitutional Convention started, it was clear that this was not going to be about tinkering around the edges of making improvements on the Articles of Confederation. That immediately when it started, people were putting forth plans that were basically a complete rewrite of the government of the United States of America. And you learned about this in high school. You're learning about it again now, but it's just good to know what these plans were and how the conflict between the plans were resolved. So, as you know, the Virginia Plan was presented. As it says, it presented on by a Virginian, but it was presented on behalf of those states that had a, a very large population. And because we are humans and humans are power hungry and seeking power most of the time or some of the time, the Virginia Plan was designed in order to magnify the power of the populous states. That they were basically hardcore, that democracy is one person, one vote, and the states that have the most people in them should have the most say in the decisions that are made. And so, the Virginia plan has is bicameral. It offers a legislature that has two houses. The lower house, like the House of Representatives, was based on population. So the more populous you were, the more say that you got. But they even went a little bit farther in magnifying the power of populous states by allowing the lower house to choose the Senate, who is going to serve in the Senate. So it's sort of like, wait a second, that you're not just giving, it's not just one person, one vote, but you're really kind of giving this magnified power to the populous states. Congress was very strong. It had the ability to nullify state laws that they believed were in violation of the Constitution, again, magnifying the power of the populous states. And also, it was a parliamentary style of government that Congress had chose who the executive officers and the judges were going to be. So it fuses power. All the power sort of stems from this lawmaking branch. And so while it magnifies the power of the populous states, there was a lot of concern that the Virginia plan was just tyranny of the majority. Majority rules, and anybody who is not a populous state is going to be basically trampled by the populous states. And so there was a counter plan that was proposed at the convention called the New Jersey Plan. And so the New Jersey Plan it wants to push against this plan that gives power to the states that have the most people. And they returned to the unicameral plan that was in the Articles of Confederation. They wanted there to be a single chamber of Congress, unicameral, and that states would all be equal players. Each state got one vote. They also did not support the fusion of power, giving Congress the most power and allowing to dictate and control the other branches of government, the court and the executive branch. The New Jersey plan wants those powers to be separated. And so Congress has power over itself, but then there would be other mechanisms for electing the president and appointing justices. Okay, so the power was separated. Well, you can kind of see where this is going because of those two plans comes compromise. There were actually enough, at one point, there was actually enough votes to pass the Virginia plan. And so majority could have ruled at the Constitutional Convention. But without New York and New Jersey in support of the Virginia plan, there was no way that without their buy-in to the Constitution, it was a failed project. So we knew that there needed to be a compromise, and that great compromise comes from the Connecticut plan. And so the Connecticut plan takes a little bit from the Virginia plan and a little bit from the New Jersey plan. At it adopts separation of power, as we will see in a moment, and it also creates a legislature that is bicameral. The House based on population, the Senate, each state gets equal representation, regardless of how populous it is. And so this was a huge point of contention, this battle over representation. And as they talk about in your textbook, it almost brought the Constitutional Convention to its knees. But through the compromise, we were able to come up with a general outline for how this government was going to be structured. The other point of conflict at the Constitutional Convention was the conflict over slavery. As I mentioned before, that slavery was legal everywhere in 1787 in the United States, except in Massachusetts. Um, but so the question should slavery be ended? And the answer was a compromise, um, in a tremendous compromise, and you know, basically, I think there was just sort of an understanding that if a hardcore line was taken by the abolitionists, and there were many abolitionists at the Constitutional Convention, particularly those from the northern states, that that there would be no constitution, right? And that it could very well just be the end of the United States, and it would, just sort of ravel away and unravel under the Articles of Confederation because it was not a strong enough constitution. And so, kind of a choice was made that it's better to have a constitution, even if it is just giving freedom to some, rather than not having a constitution which would give freedom to no one. And as we know, the issue over slavery in the United States was not resolved until civil war, nearly 100 years later, right in the 1865. Um, and so those were just sort of the realities of what was taking place at the Constitutional Convention. You can see that there was a lot of tiptoeing around the issue of slavery in the Constitution itself. The word slave is not used. That in the Constitution you hear words such as other persons or people held to service or labor are used. But the word slavery is not used. Maybe too embarrassed to use that word, or maybe just seen as being too pointed if the word was slavery was used. So keep that in mind, that there was this realism, and kind of I guess an unpleasant uh, realism that the Constitutional Convention wasn't going to solve the issue of slavery. And so there are several places in the or a couple of places in the Constitution, though, that do address slavery. Article 4, Section 2 establishes slaves as property. That is, if slaves run to another state, they could not declare themselves free. And Article 1, Section 9 does put a limitation on how long slaves can be imported into the United States. And so it allows for the importation of slaves until the year 1808. And again, that's sort of a compromise that some felt that once you end the importation of slavery, that was the first step towards ending slavery. That wasn't the case. But it was seen as sort of we can't end it, but we can at least limit the importation. So another place where, since slavery wasn't going to be ended, the question was, well, for people who are slaves, are they citizens or are they property? And if they're property, should they be counted as towards representation in the Congress, or if they're citizens, should they should they not be? I mean, so sort of how should slaves be counted? Not surprisingly, the southern states said yes, slaves should be counted for purposes of representation. And you would think, well, wait a second, if these folks are property and you're using them as property, why would southern states want to count them? Well, it doesn't power, right? Because the vast majority of slaves were held in the southern states. And if the slaves were not counted, the representation that southern states would get in the House of Representatives would be greatly diminished. So they're like, yes, count slaves as full people. The northern states, both for moral reasons, said, look, if you're treating these people as property, then you shouldn't count them as citizens, right? You can't have it both ways, the southern states. But also it was a power play, right? That they were sort of like, no, we don't want slaves to be counted because that will diminish the power of the southern states in the House of Representatives. And so there's the compromise, the famous 3/5 compromise. And say what you will about standing your ground, right? That maybe the North should have stood its ground. But that would have led to no constitution. And say what you will about the dirtiness of compromises, but sometimes compromises need to be made in order to achieve a potentially greater good. That is a constitution that would ultimately have the mechanisms for equal treatment of people. And so the three-fifths compromise is that, when it comes to apportionment for the House of Representation, in other words, as we're trying to figure out how many people, how many representatives each state should have, each slave would be counted as three-fifths of a person. Okay, so if you had 10 slaves in your state, for purposes of figuring out how much representation you should get in the House, they would be counted as 6 people. Don't get confused. That doesn't mean people who are held in slavery have voting rights, that their vote is worth three-fifths. That's not what that is. It's only for counting up population. And so those are the sort of ways in which those conflicts over slavery were resolved. Not really resolved, but dealt with. So the last thing we're going to talk about is two major features of the architecture or the mechanisms in the Constitution that basically set up, as it says there, a structure or an architecture that moves this country towards democratic decision making. And also, in order to have the will of the people heard, that the brakes need to be put on those who are designed, who would like to abuse and magnify their power in a way that would harm what is in the greater good of the people of the United States. And so, if you're interested, I'll put this on our Canvas site. Daniel Ellen, who you watched the video of, the Democratic theorist, just recently wrote, and I would have included it in our readings, but it really just came out a couple of days ago. She wrote this great article called "The Flawed Genius of the Constitution," where she, discusses that how out of the flaws of the Constitutional Convention that we create this Constitution that has this structure, this architecture, these mechanisms to ensure freedom for more people rather than no people. And so out of these flaws comes the Constitution with specific mechanisms in place that move government in the direction of better serving the people. Okay, so you read that article; it's great. But within the article, she has an excerpt from the Federalist Papers. As we know, the Federalist Papers are these essays that were written and printed in newspapers, basically making a case for why the Constitution of the United States should be ratified. And James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, they were the authors of the Federalist Papers, although Madison and Hamilton write most of them. This is an excerpt from Federalist number 51, right? And it says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, additional precautions beyond the people to make sure that government doesn't abuse its power. I love that quote because it's like, dude, if all people were angels, right, we'd always be doing the right thing. We would always be governed by the principles of justice. We would always look out for the greater good and put our personal interests, and angels probably don't even have personal interests, to the side. But we are not angels. We're humans. We're flawed. We seek power. We make irrational decisions, right? And so we need to basically, come up with a architecture of democracy that works. If there are angels at the helm, awesome. But there ain't going to be no angels at the helm. There's going to be people at the helm. So we've got to make sure we come up with mechanisms to make sure that our democracy works, regardless of whether there are good, just people at the helm or less than good, just people at the helm, right? That we have mechanisms that keep the abuse of power at bay, okay? And so we're going to look at two features of the Constitution that keep the abuses of power at bay. One is the separation of powers, and the other is checks and balances. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so let's look at the first mechanism that is in our Constitution that keeps power in check. And that mechanism is known as the separation of powers. And the separation of powers is where different powers are placed into separate groups, and that those separate groups must work together in order for any decisions to be made. And so we see that in our Constitution that we have three distinct institutions with three distinct authorities over power. We have the legislature, which is basically where the will of the people comes through, right? This is what the people want. We want to raise taxes, or the people want to have a particular sort of health care, or the people want to have a minimum wage, whatever it is, right? I mean, that the legislature is, a reflection of what the people want, okay? And then once we know what the people want, then and only the legislature can enact those laws, right? Then the executive branch will take the will of the people and put it into action. This is what the people want. Okay, we're going to figure out how to put that will of the people into action. Only the executive branch can do that. They execute the law, okay? And then the judiciary says, well, look, if there's a dispute that rises over the law itself or how that law is put into action. Are these laws constitutional? Is the way that law was put into action constitutional? Then they have the power to settle that dispute, okay? The legislature can't, settle the dispute over constitutionality of law. The executive branch cannot pass laws, okay? But they have their separate powers. And just some other, examples of that would be that Congress has the power to declare war. The president and the executives, because the president's the commander in chief and the Department of Defense is a part of the executive branch, they basically fight that war, right? And then the judiciary would determine whether or not the war that has been declared is constitutional, or the way that war is being fought is constitutional, okay? There are separate powers that they have. But that also that no one branch can, they need to cooperate with the other branches in order to get things done as well. And that will become more apparent when we take a look at the other mechanism, which is checks and balances. The reason that separation of power is seen as a mechanism on the abuse of power is that it's easier for people to hold power accountable if that power is limited. And so if you have one branch that can make decisions, execute decisions, and then determine whether or not those decisions and actions are constitutional, people don't really know who to hold accountable, right? But if you say, hey, wait a second, only the legislative branch is supposed to make the decisions, but here we have the judiciary that's basically making laws, you know who to hold accountable. The judiciary has overstepped its bounds, okay? Also, there's a competition between the branches to hold each other accountable. So the people can hold the branches accountable when they say, hey, wait a second, you're doing something like president, you're acting like a lawmaker, stop that, But the branches can hold themselves accountable as well. And so that if the executive branch is looking at the legislative branch and saying, hey, get out of my, territory, that's not your power jurisdiction, then there's a natural competition that develops. And so the separation of powers, is this division of power into separate groups, is a way to put the brakes on an abuse of power. It even goes farther than that, that you can't hold office. You can't be in the legislature and in the executive branch, because then you'd be like, whoa, like magnifying my power. Also, one branch can't select the members of another branch. So it's like Congress selects the judges, well, then the judges, they'd expect the judges to do the bidding of Congress. And if they don't, then they'd say, well, we're going to just put some new judges in there, right? So there are lots of mechanisms within our Constitution that hold those institutions separate and make it so that people, even though they're power hungry, cannot like play in the sandbox of the legislative branch and the executive branch. You got to choose one and you stick with it. Your textbook has, a little graphic that you can take a look at that describes the powers associated with each of the three branches of government. The other mechanism that's in our Constitution is known as checks and balances. And checks and balances are that sort of second part of the separation of powers. Power is separated into different institutions, but they also kind of need to cooperate to get things done. And so the checks and balances make it so that no one branch can really take any significant action without the oversight and influence of the other branches. Okay. And so you can't exercise power, one branch can't exercise power without the oversight or participation of another branch. Again, it places a mechanism in place so that power is less likely to be abused. So, example, the legislature can pass laws with a simple majority, but then the president must sign off on that law, right? That they enact that law. But they can also say, nope, we don't want that law, even though the majority of people in the House and the majority of people in the Senate want this law. I, single individual president, are vetoing it and overriding, saying, nope, you can't have that law. But if you get enough people, a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, you can override that veto. Okay. So the thinking is that you can't have the tyranny of one, right? But it does take a supermajority in order to impose the will, which is probably good because if it's just a simple majority, that could be tyranny the majority. But if the supermajority wants something to be done, they should be able to override that kind of veto. Another example is that the Senate approves justices that are nominated by the president. The president says, hey, I want this person to be a justice. But then the Senate gets to confirm that judicial nominee. And they can say no or yes. And furthermore, that if the president nominates and the Senate confirms, then the court is there in order to review whether or not the laws that Congress passes are in fact constitutional. So you could say that, maybe the president wants a justice that has anti-constitutional or tendencies, and the Senate is cool with that. Yeah, give me that justice that is gonna be anti-constitutional. And then and then they're like, we got that justice on board so we can pass a lot of unconstitutional laws. Well, newsflash, the judiciary can look at those laws and say, nope, that law is null and void because of judicial review, because it's unconstitutional, right? And so it then moves the president to pick a justice that conforms to the Constitution, and it sends the message to the Senate that you better pass constitutional laws because that there would be a limit on that. And the Constitution can be amended by the people as well, so it gives the people a say in it. It's not perfect, right? You could see that one party could have control of the presidency and the Congress and the judiciary, even though it's nonpartisan, it is partisan, right? And so there are limits to this, right? The mechanisms can only curb the abuses of power to a certain extent. But it does a fairly good job given the limits of human governance. And you can take a look at the graphic in your textbook that shows the checks and balances. Okay, thanks for hanging in here. I know it was a little bit longer than I would have liked, but this is important stuff. And so I hope you enjoyed and learned, and I will talk to you later.